Shalom, I'm Dr. Deanna Dye with Foundations in Torah and Bible Interact TV. This is the third session in our series, Early Morning Blessings. And so basically we're going through the blessings in the Siddur, starting with shortly after the first blessing really in the morning is when one opens their eyes and says, Moda ani lefanecha is a rehearsal for the resurrection. And that particular information will be found on the series Service of the Heart, which is an 8-part series and kind of goes before this one, although you don't have to listen to them in that order. This particular session is dealing with the early morning blessings where one enters into the house or the synagogue, or for us, into our home to meet God, to have God come and dwell with us and be in His presence. So we've been laying the groundwork for all the various prayers. Last time we concluded with the prayer, the Akedah, which is the binding of Isaac, which is in many congregations, not in every, and certainly this isn't, not everywhere you go will read this in a public setting, but very often will be read privately, and that is, again, Genesis 22, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. So that's something that's read every day. Now this session we're going to continue on from there. We're going to look at the first prayer kind of goes to called La Olam, and let's just go through sort of some of the elements of that. Now La Olam means the world, or it's basically translated always, and it's really kind of a summation of the whole faith. So as they go through the prayer, they're reminded or summarizing the basic tenets of the Jewish faith and expressing loyalty to God. It comes from an assortment of scriptures. But the idea out of this comes that we are basically moving to pray for a time when everyone will recognize the truth of the Torah. So it has a very sort of universal flavor to it, as a kind of reminder that we want everybody to understand the importance and the key is the Torah as the foundation of your faith and of your life, etc. And certainly we need that today. We certainly need it in our nation today. Now let's just look at some of the scriptures that go along with that. This is from Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. It says, "When the time arrives when all these things have come upon you, both the blessing and the curse, and you are there among the nations to which God has driven you, you will start thinking about what has happened to you, and you will return to the Lord." And from there, Deuteronomy 30, verses 3 through 5, "At that point, Adonai your God will reverse your exile and show mercy. He will return and gather you from all the peoples to which Adonai your God has scattered you." And so this becomes the hallmark of this next series of prayers. The idea is that He will bring you back into your land, that the land your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it. So this is really the heartbeat of the Jewish people. Certainly they have been scattered to the four corners of the earth on numerous occasions. But the goal and the desire is to always to return to the land, because that is the place of redemption. I mean, going all the way back, you think about them being in the land of Egypt, and they come out. Eventually, they make it to the land in a very long, roundabout way. And this is sort of the nature of the history of mankind, certainly among the Jewish people. It seems to be the long, roundabout way, but eventually they make it back. But it really is the core of the Torah, the core of the prayer service too, the redemption and the return to the land. We see this also if we look in John chapter 11, verse 52. It says, Caiaphas, prophesying that Yeshua the Messiah was about to die on behalf of the nation, and not for that nation alone, but so that he might gather into one the scattered children of Israel. So a daily reminder to us that we are scattered because of our disobedience. And so the service, the prayer service, is designed for those who are scattered. Even though we're scattered, there's a way that we can come together as a community. And so through the service, the hope is kept alive about returning to the land and having God be in our presence in the land. This is, as I said, a repeated theme throughout the prayer service over and over again, this idea of the ingathering of those that are scattered, but that God meets those that are scattered as well. He is in their presence, in the presence of their community. Now this is from Acts 8:4. It says, "Those who were scattered announced the good news of the word wherever they went. So we remain in a scattered place, and that is the key. And God does the scattering. Now, even though it's a punishment, if you will, He always brings a restoration out of that. So it's an opportunity to go into the four corners of the world and bring the Word, bring the Torah to those four corners. He strategically places us in every part of the globe to be able to bring the Torah and bring that Word to the peoples where we've been scattered among. Remember, it says in Matthew 24:31, He will send out His angels with a great shofar, and they will gather together His chosen ones from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So the promise there, repeated over and over again in the prayer service and certainly in the Torah, and we find here also in the New Testament in Matthew, when the sound of the shofar comes, the regathering of all those that are His, that have been scattered, they'll be regathered into the land, and the redemption will take place. This is always speaking of the remnant. Micah 7:18 through 20 tells us, "Who is a God like you, pardoning the sin and overlooking the crimes of the remnant of His heritage? He does not retain His anger forever because He delights in grace. He will again have compassion on us. He will subdue our iniquities." And speaking to the remnant about throwing their sins into the depths of the sea. So a daily reminder that in spite of the judgment upon us, that we have been scattered, that God loves us, has mercy and compassion upon us each day. Remember, His mercies are renewed each morning. That's the whole concept, really, of the prayer service, is the renewal of those mercies. And an opportunity every day for you to approach, to come into His presence and allow His mercy to be a part of your life as you repent and turn from your sins each day, that those sins be thrown into the depth of the sea. Now, this is from Isaiah 56:7. "I will bring them ultimately, as we are scattered through the four corners of the earth, to my holy mountain, Mount Moriah, the place of the temple. My house, the Beit HaMikdash, will be called a house of prayer for all nations." So it isn't just a house of prayer for Jewish people. It's a house of prayer for all nations, for everyone who's been scattered, who by faith receives from God. And it was credited to Abraham as righteousness, in the same way all the nations. And so what takes place at the temple, the burnt offerings, the sacrifices, they will all be accepted on His altar, He says, because my house will be called a house of prayer. But we forget sometimes about the first part of this verse, don't we? That the burnt offerings have been accepted. And we've talked about the burnt offerings going back to the Akedah, that Isaac was the burnt offering. They'd be accepted. That Noah built an altar of burnt offering when he came off the ark. That Cain and Abel, that act of murder that Cain committed against his brother Abel, was at the altar of offering when Abel brought the burnt offering. And on even back into the garden. So it was a very foundational offering, morning and evening, and it's part of the prayer service. From Mark 11:17, it says, "Let a person be God-fearing privately and publicly. Acknowledge the truth, speak the truth within his heart, and arise early." So the idea of arising early is the opportunity to come into the presence of God and for Him to mold and shape your character as you either bring your burnt offering in the physical way at the temple, or you bring your burnt offering in a spiritual sense by the fruit of your lips and the words of your heart. Isaiah 40:15 tells us that the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. Now from there we're moving into another prayer called Atahu. And this prayer, this is how it goes. "You are the first and the last, and other than you there is no God. Again, gather in the dispersed who yearns for you from all the four corners." Hardly a prayer that doesn't speak about the gathering from the four corners. But the idea is that God Himself is the first and the last, which relates again to the burnt offering, because you have the first in the morning was the burnt offering, and the last in the evening was the burnt offering. So they're making the comparison in this prayer between God and the burnt offering. And This particular portion is actually repeated in the prayers for the Shema, and when we get to that, that'll be in another series just called the Shema. It'll talk about this in a little more detail. So let's look at some of the examples of this. So we have from Revelation 1:8, I am the Alpha, the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Of course, the Alpha, Omega being the Greek. I am the first and the last, the living one. I was dead, but look, I am alive forever and ever. And from 2:8, here is the message from the first and the last who died and came alive again. So this idea of him being the beginning and the end, the first and the last, we can find in a number of places in the scriptures, certainly, and also in the prayer service. The idea is that those who walk on the earth recognize and know that you alone are God, you are supreme over all the kingdoms of this world, that you made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And this from 2 Kings 19:15, with the prayer that Hezekiah prayed when he received a letter from the messengers sent by the king of Assyria, bad guy, who was taunting them and letting the people know that their God could not save them and their God would not be able to prevent Assyria from taking Jerusalem. And so it was that Hezekiah took that letter and he went up into the house of God, the temple, and he spread it out over and he prayed that prayer. God, you made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And we find that particular prayer, which is out of Psalm 146, in a number of places, even in the New Testament, specifically twice in the book of Acts. So that was a very foundational prayer. This is from Zephaniah 3:20. At that time I will bring you, and at that time I will gather you in, for I set you up for renown and praise among the peoples of the earth, when I bring back your captivity before your own eyes. And so that the prayer Atahu that we just read, that he is the first and last, has within it this promise, the daily deliverance and salvation from God's enemies, from our enemies, and a reminder daily that God will return and restore his people from captivity. He will bring them back from the land from which they were scattered. Now the next section begins the whole idea of the offerings. There's a lot of information there. I would encourage you just to read, if you have a Siddur, to read all the different offerings. I'm not going to go through each offering and explain it because that would be an entire study. It would take weeks and weeks and weeks. But just so you know, all the different offerings are mentioned and it's a good idea to read it. The word offering comes from the root karav, which means to draw near, and that was the purpose of the offering. Again, this is a whole section and a section worthy of study. And really, if you want to understand the offerings, this would be the place to do it. This particular section is read every day, so you have an opportunity every day to read about the various offerings and to learn about the elevation offering and the thank offering, and the guilt offering and the fellowship offering, and the sin offering and the incense offering, etc. But it was that the offering system was designed to bring Israel close, or to draw near to God. Even if they didn't completely understand all that it meant, God had a purpose in it to teach and instruct them, and instruct the people of God how to draw near. Now, this is a quote from the Megillah. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. It says, I will consider it as if they had brought the sacrifices, and I will forgive their sins. So even by reading it, of course, with the right attitude of the heart, God will accept it as if and forgive the sins. And certainly all through the service is an opportunity to repent and ask him to forgive the sins, your sins, whoever. And so contained within the offerings is the idea of a complete submission of one's will and thoughts and emotions and resources. Everything that you are, you have an opportunity to submit those to God. And Abraham asked God how Israel would achieve forgiveness when the temple was in ruins. Because obviously the temple is in ruins, they can't be making offerings. And God replied, when Israel recites the scriptural order of the offerings, just reciting it, I will consider as if they had been that atonement had taken place and forgive their sins. This is from Rabbi Hirsch. He said, the temple has fallen, the altar has disappeared, the harps of the singers are heard no more, but their spirit has become the heritage of Israel, speaking, and this is speaking of that divine service. So it's God has designed it all so that we can't get very far from Him, and that there's still a way to approach, and there's still a way for these things to take place, in spite of the fact that we don't have a temple standing. This is from Menachot 110a. It says, "Whoever involves himself in the study of the sin offering is regarded as if he had actually brought a sin offering." Again, all in the context of the community. That's the key here. The community remains the key. Now, we did mention about the laver last session. We're going to pick it up here because there's more in the actual service that will point us to this. For a in-depth discussion on the laver, I would suggest that you read Exodus 17, verses 17 through 21. Again, I said it was a physical act with a spiritual reality, and you can certainly learn about that as you read that in Exodus. And when one performs the act, one must do it with one's whole heart, and one can make a spiritual application in the doing of it. Now, before the priest was chosen by lot for the service for the day, he one of the early service of the day required them cleaning the altar and starting up the fires. So before they even began with the cleaning of the altar and starting up the fires, they had to first wash at the laver. That was very important. From Tamid 1:4, it says, "Take heed that thou touch not the vessel before thou hast sanctified their hands and feet in the laver." So they had to take care of that before they did anything. And in the process of the priest washing himself, now of course in the first temple, I remind you, the laver had 12 different spigots, but they would let the water run out over their hands and over their feet, while laying the right hand and the right foot and the left foot in the left hand. So it would go over each one, and they would wash over it, let the water just literally run over it. Again, I mentioned that there were 12 spigots in the first temple. And before the priests even started that temple service, and certainly the cleaning of the altar had to be first, this water that they took was sanctified and set apart for that purpose. And now by the time we get to, at the first temple, it's what we call a large copper basin. Doesn't really look like what we have here in this picture. This picture here really represents what an artist sees in the second temple period. But in the first temple period, the large copper basin was in the temple courtyard itself. And I think I have a picture here. Yeah, this is what they think it kind of looked like. So it was called the Kior. Now, the picture you saw previously, how the sages describe it is it's that particular design of the Kior, the wash basin, was an example of the beautification or improvement of a commandment. So the copper laver they had in the desert had 2 spigots. The copper laver they had in the first temple had 12 spigots, and then you saw the one that we had in the slide previous. In the second temple period, a priest named Ben Katin, this is from Yoma 3:10, apparently redesigned the laver to include the 12 spigots that they had from the first temple. And at the same time, they constructed a special reservoir that sat atop the laver that enabled the water to be stored overnight. And they determined that this was the sanctified temple vessel, because they actually didn't store the water. It was forbidden to store the water in the laver itself. So they figured out a way to store it not in the laver, but in a special reservoir. And so this design made a separate reservoir so that it would actually maintain the sanctity of the vessel. The reservoir that was separate from the actual laver was called a mukni. Now I've got a picture here because the Temple Institute in Jerusalem has constructed the new laver for the temple. And so it's called the crown of the laver, which was this Hebrew word mukni. And so upon the mukni, or its modern day equivalent, is where this crown that we have would sit, the mukni being the reservoir. This improvement, they said, was designed to increase the ease and comfort of the priests using the laver. They also said that the device could be heard as far as Jericho, with the sound inaugurated during the morning temple service. So that's kind of interesting. I guess it was pretty loud. Now, the laver in the tabernacle had two parts, had a basin and a stand. It was made of the brass from the mirrors given by the women who served in the sanctuary. And it stood between the door of the tabernacle and the place of the altar of burnt offering. This is where Aaron and his sons would wash their hands and feet before entering the tabernacle. Now, Solomon's temple had 10 lavers of bronze, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left, and they were facing eastward. And you can read that in 1 Kings 8:27 through 39. So that's kind of interesting. They did manage to make additions that they felt still they didn't violate the commandment, they didn't violate the Torah, but they would make things easier. So let's read this in John 13:5. It says, "Then he poured some water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the Talmudim and wiped them off with a towel wrapped around him. For I have set you an example so that you may do as I have done." So the holiness of the priests and the Levites then was transferred to the whole people after the destruction of the temple. And this prayer then became a substitute, the prayer that we're talking about in the Siddur. And it took the place of the sacrifices, literally, and so with the washing of the hands. So it was, by the time we get to the time of Yeshua, a custom of the washing of the hands like that, common, and a custom mentioned among the Jews. I believe they said it was in the epistle of Pseudo Aristeas. It was a ceremonial cleaning like the priest did in the temple. So everything became a substitute or replacement for what was done in the temple, and it became part of their worship and their service. And it was, of course, related to the temple purity of the priests. It says, if I, your master, have washed your feet for you, how much more should you wash the feet of another? So Yeshua, of course, takes it one step further in that role of submission and washing one another's feet, but all related really to the service that we had in the temple. Now from there we're going to move on to the whole ceremony of the ashes and the incense. Before you get to the incense, before you get to the burnt offering, you got to clean out the ashes. And you can read about that in Leviticus 6:1 through 6. So we have here, there's a difference. The word is deshen, which can mean the ashes of fat, or they can mean the actual fat of an animal. So the idea is there, with the burning of an animal, the ashes and the fat of the burnt offering are mixed together and that would make something fat. So that's how they came to this particular term, the ashes, the deshen. And so the concept is, to us, out of the ashes spring forth new life. That's kind of relates to the fat, new life in the Messiah. So we've got the fat and the smoke that go up, and the connection there with the Spirit and the ascending of new life coming forth out of the ashes. And each day, there were two services. One was a ceremonial service, and the other one was actually something functional, where they removed too many ashes. But they first removed a very small portion of the ashes from the previous day's offering, and that was the ceremonial part. And it was done first thing in the morning before the Tamid offering, before the Tamid, the daily offerings started. That would be the burnt offering and the incense offering. And they actually had on the fire 3 different, what we call pyres. There were 3 fires on the altar. There was a large pyre, where the offerings were burnt. There was a second pile or pyre for the incense, from which the burning coals were taken and brought into the sanctuary for the morning and afternoon incense service. And there was a third pyre that kept the flame burning for the perpetuation of the flame, that had to be kept burning at all times in case the other fires went out. So the priests would pick up the ashes and take the glowing ashes from the burnt flesh of the offerings, and not from the wood, but from the offerings. And that was part of the functional, that they had, sometimes it built up, they had to clear it off. So this removal of the ashes, again, 2 parts. There was a ceremonial part. That part for the service was no larger than a handful and was actually placed on the floor of the courtyard to the east of the ramp leading up to the altar. And this removal of the ashes was required every morning. So it was part of the daily morning service to remove the ashes. Whether or not the altar had to be cleaned of ashes was another story. This ceremony with the handful had to be done each morning. And in order to do anything with the removing of the ashes, the priest had to remove his garments. So now the cleaning of the altar itself was done when there was accumulation of ash. So it wasn't necessarily the case that it was done every day, but probably more than likely. The ashes were taken, those ashes, now remember we had a little handful and we put them by the east side of the ramp of the altar. This is all the ashes that needed to be removed were taken outside the camp to a designated place outside of Jerusalem, and that was a service, a special service that went on as well. Here's a quote from Rabbi Hirsch. By taking a portion from yesterday's service and placing it at the side of the altar before beginning today's service, the Kohen symbolizes a national declaration that today we will continue to serve God just as we did yesterday according to his will. So that ash that was put down by the altar, by the ramp, was kind of maybe what we would call first fruits of the ashes, if you will. And really all of this that we're talking about now is really the first service of the day, Terumat Hadashen, the separating of the ash, removing the previous day's ash, scooping up the shovelful from the innermost ashes on the altar and placing it on the floor in the courtyard we just mentioned, and then the ashes of the burnt offering having to be removed as well. So when you're reading that in Leviticus, it does sound a little bit confusing, but just remember there's two different services that are being mentioned here. The idea is that the priest is wearing his best for the master, so he has to change clothes. Since he will be moving a great deal of ash, and he would soil his garments, before removing the ash, he would remove his regular garments and change into something older and more worn so that he didn't ruin the garments. The sages said it was unseemly to wear the same clothing when pouring wine for his master than one wore in the kitchen. So there's a certain clothing you wear for the menial tasks and clothing you wore to approach the king, and they felt that the clothing worn for the sort of menial task of removing the ashes, which would cause their garments to be soiled, that's why they would change into something older. So we go through here, and then the priest would take a silver shovel and walk up the ramp, and he would use that shovel to stir the coals, and then he would collect the small amount of ashes, and this begins the preparation for the altar and for a new day of service. And really a reminder to us to prepare each day symbolically that altar, to come into the presence of God each day and prepare our heart for a new service, and keeping the fires stoked just as the priest had to do when he went to collect the ashes. This is from Rev Simcha Bunim. The clearing and gathering and moving of the ashes is part of the spiritual work of God, that he did not put us on the earth to separate from the world, but to elevate the world. So there's this idea of this service or this ceremony elevating the world, if you will, and keeping the fires burning on the altar and keeping those fires burning in our lives, to keep the fires of passion towards God burning in our lives each day, because it is out of the ash that new life will come. And Rav Nachman of Breslev said that the ashes were all that was left of the fiery and passionate sacrifice to God. So when you think about what happens with the offering, it's kind of interesting. Rav Nachman also said, if you want the spiritual fire, search the ashes, because when you realize that you come from the earth and dust, then you will find the wings to fly. So rather poetic, but all this connection to the ashes and the new life coming forward, and that new life coming forward each day as we enter into the presence of God. Now, at a fixed time, one of the priests would take what we call the silver mata, or the shovel, which I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and ascend the altar and push the large coals aside. I just talked about that. Then he took a shovelful of ashes and charred wood, and then he descended, went northward, and deposited the ashes in a heap on the floor, as we mentioned. This spot had the ashes from the golden altar that was inside the holy place, and the menorah. So the same pile where we had the sort of first fruits of the ashes is the same pile where the ashes come from the altar of incense, from inside the holy place, and from the menorah. Some say that those ashes in that little heap by the ramp fell through a grate in the floor. Some say they were removed later. We don't exactly know. And now, when taking the large shovelful, there's a word used here which will make sense in a moment called the magraphot. And they made a heap called a tepuach, which means like an altar. And that was in the center of the altar. And other priests would place various portions aside the sacrifice that had not been consumed during the night. And when the ash heap was large, again, I mentioned it was removed to the outside of the city. And the priests would actually bring all kinds of wood for this, except for olive and vine. The main wood they used, though, was actually fig wood. But they would build a new pyre and replace the unconsumed portions of the sacrifice. Now, the second pyre was for the burning of the incense. And they selected, this was for sure fig wood, which I think is kind of interesting. And then they would light the pyre. This is from Hebrews 9:13. For if sprinkling ceremonially unclean persons with the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of the red heifer restores their outward purity, how much more the blood of Messiah. So that concludes this session. We've covered quite a bit in terms of the laver and the washing of the hands and the water, the living water that's supposed to water their hands and feet, wash their hands and feet, and introducing the whole idea of the removal of the ashes. And in our last session, we're going to go a little bit further, and we're going to be talking about the actual incense ceremony. Once the ashes are removed for the burnt altar, and once the ashes are removed for the incense service, then the daily or the Tamid service can begin. So we'll see you next time. Shalom.